All right, let's get started. Welcome to today's Harvard Data Science Initiative Industry Seminar. I'm Jen Chow, I'm Director of External Engagement, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Maria Bowman from the USDA's Economic Research Service. Maria is an agricultural economist in the Conservation and Environment branch of the Resource and Rural Economics Division of the USDA. She studies the economic and environmental impacts of conservation and soil health management in U.S. agriculture and co-leads the USDA Inflation Reduction Act Greenhouse Gas Quantification Action Area, charged with improving the spatial and temporal coverage of national conservation activity data. Her career has spanned a wide range of issues at the intersection of agriculture and economics, including studies on antibiotic use, sustainability labeling, and deforestation. In addition to the USDA, Maria has held roles at the Soil Health Partnership, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Maria has degrees from Juniata College, Virginia Tech, and a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from UC Berkeley. We're excited to have Maria with us, not only because her work is urgent and interesting, but also because the USDA is a critical champion for issues that the HDSI cares deeply about, including climate mitigation and food security. In fact, if you've been following along with us, you might know that tomorrow we're kicking off the HDSI Agri-Datathon in collaboration with the USDA. So stay tuned. We'll be excited to share out the winning projects really soon. Before I hand over to Maria, I'd like to remind our audience that there will be time after her presentation for questions. Audience members should use the Q&A function to send in their questions at any point during the presentation. And please, please don't be shy. All questions are good questions. So thank you and welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Jen. Very excited to be here today in advance of the Agri-Datathon. I've been hearing about all kinds of connections I hadn't even thought of between the work that's going on here at Harvard and what's going on at USDA. So very happy to be able to share a little bit of the work that we have going on that we think will be relevant to yours. And let's see if I can get this shared correctly. Okay. Jen, are we good on slides?
Great.
Perfect. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about conservation practice used by U.S. agricultural producers. And that can mean a lot of things. So don't worry, I'm going to talk about what I mean by conservation practices as well. But I'm mostly going to be talking about the work I've been doing, as Jen mentioned, as part of this Inflation Reduction Act greenhouse gas quantification area. And we've been bringing together diverse data sources across USDA and trying to figure out how we can better leverage the data we already have to estimate conservation practice use and also figure out how to address some of those data gaps, either by gathering new data in existing surveys, using new data sources, and using some data sources we might not have used in the past. Why do we care about conservation practice use? This may be old news for you all, but agricultural practices influence environmental and economic outcomes. So when I say environmental outcomes, I'm thinking about things like air quality, water quality, and greenhouse gas emissions. And economic outcomes, obviously, every decision a producer makes is tied to the profitability of what they're doing on their land, right? So in addition to those environmental outcomes that we care about, those decisions also influence yield, profitability, input costs, et cetera. And data on practice adoption and outcomes help us understand how practices are tied to outcomes. So we might look at data on tillage practices that a producer is using, and then look at how those impact soil erosion, or cover crops and how those impact water quality. Importantly, for the talk I'm giving today, data on practices feed models, for example, the DayCent model that estimates agriculture's contribution to US greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the model that does cropland. There's also another model that does livestock, but modeling generally is one of the applications we're thinking about for these data that we're bringing together in this context. And just to contextualize agriculture's contribution to US greenhouse gas emissions a little bit, and here we're talking about emissions, ignoring for a second the carbon sequestration that might come from changes in land use management. We're talking mostly about methane and nitrous oxide, and agriculture represents about 10% of US greenhouse gas emissions. There are three big buckets for that. You'll see on the right-hand side here in this pie. We have agricultural soil management, which is almost half of those emissions. enteric fermentation, which accounts for more than a quarter of emissions, and then manure management. And these data are publicly available from the USA EPA's inventory of US greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. So let's unpack those buckets a little bit. Enteric fermentation. Enteric fermentation is a natural process that happens inside of an animal when they eat food, and that's primarily ruminant animals. So here on the left, you'll see a dairy cow with some forage ration in front of it. So that's, what would be happening in a barn. A dairy cow is eating forage, they're producing milk, and there's enteric fermentation that's going on in their gut, right? And then there are methane emissions that are produced as part of that process. So what impacts those methane emissions and how much methane emissions are being produced? We're still learning about this. And in a lot of cases, we're still learning the relationship between practices and outcomes. But in general, what you feed to the animal impacts methane emissions. There's also feed additives that you can potentially use to reduce methane emissions and other technologies that are being explored. So that's one big bucket that we talked about in the previous slide. In the middle, you see composted manure that actually came from an agricultural digester. So manure management was another big bucket on that previous slide. And manure management really just refers to the way in which a livestock operation stores and manages their manure. So they might be storing it in a pile, right? Especially for cattle feed yards or cow-calf operations. They might be scraping that manure out of a barn or a housing environment and then moving it to a location where they store it dry. Now, in a swine barn or a dairy barn, for example, they might have wet manure management. So where you milk your cows, you have cows that are pooping out manure, and then you're using water and you're washing that. And that's typically stored in a lagoon or like a big concrete lagoon, which then can be covered or uncovered, which affects the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. So lots of different ways to manage manure. A lot of that has to do with, the operation, the geography of where that operation is located, the temperatures, right? Like how you manage manure is affected by how hot or cold it is in that location and the type of livestock that you had. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about manure management. And then on the far side of the slide, this is just an example of a soil management practice. This is actually cover crop interseeding, but in terms of agricultural emissions, one of the major sources of emissions is actually nitrogen fertilizer use. So it probably would be better to have a picture of someone applying fertilizer on this slide, but quite a lot of nitrous oxide emissions associated with fertilizer use, but how much nitrous oxide gets emitted can be impacted by how you apply that fertilizer, when you apply that fertilizer, and how much you apply, right? So a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about conservation practices with nutrient management is applying the 4 R's, or the right rate, the right place, right source, and right time for fertilizer. Incorporation of fertilizer is another practice that's really important in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So you can just toss the fertilizer out on the soil surface, right? Or you can place that fertilizer in the furrow actually when you're planting, or inject it into the soil, which then reduces the greenhouse gas emissions associated with fertilizer application. Moving on to the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the reason that we're doing this work around data. Inflation Reduction Act actually provided, in addition to quite a large amount of money to USDA to go toward the typical programs that USDA uses to encourage producer adoption of conservation practices, it provided about $300 million toward greenhouse gas quantification. So that work is really to understand better what the impacts are of the practices that we're paying for, and to collect better data and provide better data to the greenhouse gas inventory. And USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service is charged with implementing this section, and they're also in charge of a lot of those programs where we pay producers to implement conservation practices on the land. And in order to work with this charge in the Inflation Reduction Act, NRCS and the team managing this money established 7 action areas to address these greenhouse gas quantification goals. And I'm going to show you those on the next slide here. We've decided to represent them in several buckets. So one bucket is improving data. And the action area that I'm co-leading with Claire Borian at the National Agricultural Statistics Service is this action area that's charged with improving the temporal and spatial coverage of national conservation activity data. So obviously that fits in the improving data bucket, but there's several other action areas that are also working at that. Some of them are collecting primary agricultural agricultural data like soils data, so that's Soil Carbon Monitoring and Research Network. And then there's also a greenhouse gas research network that's focusing more on some of the other greenhouse gases aside from soil carbon monitoring. Then you'll see that there are some action areas that are focused on models and tools. So we have an action area that's looking broadly at models and tools. We call them Action Area 4. And the Greenhouse Gas Inventory and Assessment Program of USDA has their own action area. So they're one of the major, those two action areas are really some of the major stakeholders within this work for the work we're doing in our Action Area 6. And I guess importantly for this group, I kind of skipped over this, but you'll see down there's an action area number 3, data management infrastructure and capacity. And that action area is largely focused on supporting some of the larger data gathering efforts of Action Area 1 and 2 and building some of the databases and the infrastructure to house the data that are coming in through those. But we've also been working quite a lot with them on, and they are funding the environment that we've been using to bring our data together for Action Area 6. So a lot of collaboration there as well to meet the particular needs of our action area. Our goals, just so you understand the landscape of what we're trying to address here, we are trying to accelerate the collection and release of conservation trend data. So if you can think about the status quo as being different USDA agencies collecting different sources of conservation data and then releasing reports or statistical estimates on different timelines, part of what we're trying to do is just get more data out the door more quickly as we have those data available. We're also working to expand existing surveys and use satellite and geospatial data to improve the timeliness of conservation statistics. So no surprise, survey data are both costly to collect and costly to analyze. So part of what we're trying to do is figure out if there's a way to use some of the other tools that we have available, remotely sensed data, geospatial data, to complement some of those survey data. We're also needing to make sure that these data get incorporated to improve and update the conservation trends in the national greenhouse gas inventories, as I mentioned. And be thoughtful and forward-looking about how we can fill the existing and future gaps, right? So we're always thinking about how we might be able to add questions about the future, right? What do we know about feed additives right now that are available on the market? How can we start thinking about the questions we're going to need to add in the future and anticipate the needs of the inventory and other stakeholders as we go about this process? So I mentioned the landscape of conservation data across USDA, and I wanted to just give you a few examples if this is an area you're particularly interested in. So one major data source that we use describing conservation practices at USDA is the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, which is a survey that's conducted on a rolling basis by the Natural Resources Conservation Service and NASS. That really digs deep on conservation practices on fields and characterizes cropland nationally. We also have the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, which is a workhorse for us at the Economic Research Service that surveys different agricultural commodities on a rotating basis. It's also a sample of fields that asks about production practices and then also a lot about economics on those fields. And then the Census of Agriculture, although there's not a lot of data in the census about conservation practice use, we obviously have quite a lot of data from the Census of Agriculture. So this is just an example of one of the a graphical representation of cover crop use, which is one of the questions about conservation practice use on the census. When we first started this work and thought about how we might address the charge of our action area, we said, well, we'd really like to put together a data series. And I made this graphic to try and represent how we thought we might do things differently or combine across agencies to do this work. So this was kind of like my, obviously I'm not an artist, but this was like, okay, what do we need to do to produce these things that we need to improve our estimates, and what data sources are we going to use? So on the one side, you see all the data sources that we're hoping to use. In the middle, there's this like mess of new methods and machine learning and data science. And so this is, I think, what we're in the thick of figuring out right now, and probably what's most interesting to you all is this mess, right? Like, how do we take all of these data and then figure out how to do a better job estimating these practices than we've done in the past, right? Either providing new information on a, spatial and temporal frequency, right? Like giving giving some more of that to what we produce at USDA. This also gives you a sense of some of the other practices that we're talking about. I think I've mentioned cover crops and tillage. With livestock, we're again talking mostly about manure management and feed management and grazing practices. But we also wanted to focus on delivering something to the public, because while we could provide data behind the scenes to feed these models, we also think that these data are useful to other stakeholders, right? So we're committed to producing a public data series because we think this information is valuable, not just to producing the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, but also for other purposes. So how are we going about this work? You're going to hear a lot about how we've been going about this work. And the first thing we decided we needed to do was build a team of people to do this work. In some cases, we have people that understand the intricacies of these data sets at our individual agencies, right? We have a lot of subject matter experts. We also have a lot of people that have really deep knowledge of how to analyze data and data scientists, but we needed to build a team of people that could be fully dedicated to this work. And we've done that across the 4 agencies that are involved in our action area. So ERS, NASS, and then the Agricultural Research Service, which is our counterpart that does more basic agricultural research, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And while we envisioned a team, kind of sitting and having their own data-thon, in reality, what we've gotten is a number of people that are dedicated full-time to this work. And then we're drawing in a lot of these subject matter experts that have other responsibilities, because we need the support and the knowledge of the people that have been at USDA for a long time. So we're combining a number of folks that we're bringing in as climate fellows or people that are fresh out of data science programs with people that have been at USDA for a while, maybe understand some of the strengths and limitations of the data. And we've been calling this our conservation data team. So the other thing that's really interesting about this team is that we have economists, we have statisticians from NASS, we have survey experts, and we have geographers. And I mentioned the geographer and remote sensing expert side of things because this is one of the data wrangling things that's very hard about what we're doing, is that a lot of the data we're using are geospatial, right? We have these large geo databases that represent fields, or maybe in the remote sensing case, pixels, that we're trying to figure out how to integrate with survey data sources, or maybe where there are different resolutions or units of analysis. So it's really important that we have those geographers on our team. And when we set out, we said, we want one geographer at each agency that's going to be serving on this team. And I'll talk a little bit more about our process for recommending methods for producing estimates. But really what the team is doing is they're developing these methods. So they're taking stock of what data are available, thinking about what methods might be the right methods to deal with those data and produce an estimate. They're importantly, documenting methods and establishing workflows for producing these estimates, right? Because we want to do this starting in fiscal 25, and we want to do it every year after that. So having it be a replicable process, obviously that we can have some incremental improvement in workflows and how this happens, but these teams are working on developing this process. We also, in addition to a team to do this work, we needed a new place to work. And this is because the status quo at USDA is for people to work using the computing resources of their own agencies. So for example, at ERS, we have a cloud desktop that I can work in where we have access to ERS data and software. But if I want to work with NASS data or want to work with other data resources, I can't always do it in that environment. Right. And it's also not an environment where I can collaborate with colleagues from other agencies. So when Claire and I started this, we said, well, we need a new place to work. And what we envisioned was really, some cloud machines that members of multiple agencies could access, but all have access to the full suite and complement of data that we were bringing in. Needed to be secure, it needed to be high performance, accessible by all 4 agencies. And then importantly, and the one we spent the most time on, was working with NASS to figure out what requirements the environment needed to have to be approved to work with SIPC protected survey data. And SIPC is a statute that governs how NASS works with survey data and then how they let other people work with those survey data. So you'll hear from Ginger Harris, my colleague, a little bit more about that at the end. But we had to work with NASS to figure out how we could design an environment that worked for our team and for our needs, but that also met the strict requirements of working with protected survey data. One of the things that we really were passionate about was making sure that we had access to Google Earth Engine, which NASS has been using in other applications. But that obviously meant that we needed to have access to the internet as well. So had to work through how we might be able to do some of these things securely. And it's an Azure environment. I noted that down there, but just in case folks were curious. So let's talk about buckets of data and then get into the data a little bit more. So here I've bucketed them into geospatial data. And when I say geospatial data, I mean things like temperature, precipitation, climate, soils, things that might be publicly available and maybe provided by other USDA agencies. That's an example of geospatial data. Earth observation data, I also refer to as remote sensing data, but it could be from other sources than just satellites. Could be aerial photography, other types of images, but you'll hear some more about how we're working with those data. Census and survey data, I think probably pretty straightforward for you all, but those are coming from questionnaires that are fielded to producers at USDA. And then administrative data, where I'll also refer to those as program data throughout the presentation, are data that are collected as part of implementation of USDA programs. So there are a couple of different agencies at USDA that implement programs, whether that's crop insurance, conservation programs, and there are data that are gathered from producers as part of that, whether it's things they need in order to send the money out the door, it might be part of the conservation planning process, but we refer to those as administrative or program data. And I talked about SIPSIA, which is the statute that governs statistical data, but the two primary statutes that we're thinking about when we're working with these data are SIPSIA and then Section 1619, as we refer to it, which is, or the Privacy Act, or we talk about producer privacy in Section 1619. So Section 1619 is largely what prevents program agencies from disclosing producer identification and individual producer data. So that would apply mostly to those administrative data sources that I mentioned on the last slide. And then SIPSIA applies to the survey, census and survey data sources for the most part. So that just gives you a sense that like we do take these statutes very seriously. There are serious repercussions for us at USDA if we don't abide by these statutes. And so when we're designing an environment or working with these data, we have to be really thoughtful about how to design the controls and also, you know, checking in periodically on making sure no one's being let into the environment that we didn't want in there, or making sure that all of the guidelines for use that we've established for the environment are being followed in order to make sure that we don't produce unnecessary risks of disclosure. So more on the data sources, and I'm not going to talk about each one of these in detail. This slide is really more to give you a sense for one of the other challenges that we've had as we go about this work, which is working with each of these agencies or responsible agencies you see here on the side of the table to figure out how to get access to the data that we envisioned that we were going to be working with for this project. And you know, whether it's filling out a form, every agency has a different process, right? So we had to start by talking to the agency or agencies and figuring out what was required. And in many cases, that was different, right? So NASS has a very standard process that they have for accessing data, and that goes through the standard application process. You'll hear a little bit more from Ginger about that at the end, but there's a very clear process associated with accessing those SIPSIA protected survey data that I talked about. The program and administrative data varies a little more by agency. So in some cases, we were going to the agencies and talking to them about our plans, what we were thinking we might use their data for, right? So these intended uses of the data, and then hearing from them about what the potential limitations of those data sets might be for those applications. And in a lot of cases, we had to set out some agreed upon plans for like, okay, if we're going to include the data in one of the estimates, what do we need to do to go through a review and disclosure review process with that agency, right? We knew what that might look like at NASS, but we had less of an idea at the other agencies. And I'll just note that many USDA agencies work with these data for implementation of programs, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily are comfortable with having their data used for other purposes, right? And rightfully so. In some cases, those data were not designed to be collected to be used for the things that we're using them for, right? We're using pieces of the data that might be ancillary or not central to program implementation, or things where the producer might not be required to provide complete information. So in a lot of cases, we have to be very careful and follow up with the agencies to make sure that we're using the variables and the data sets correctly and not misinterpreting the data that they've provided to us, which is also, it's really an iterative and ongoing process, right? We get the data set, we start doing things with it. We have questions about the variables. We go back to them. They say, you might not be able to use that variable for what you think you can use it for. In fact, probably if you're going to use that variable, you might need to exclude these years of data or fill in missing data using this procedure. So there's a lot of maybe unwritten knowledge associated with some of these data sets because they weren't intended to be used in these applications and maybe not even shared, right? So figuring out how to use the data sets correctly has been a big investment. In some cases, we might start working with the data set and decided that we can't use it for the purpose we thought that we would, right? And I can talk a little bit about that in the context of our remote sensing evaluation as well. I don't know that I need to spend too much time on this one. I've talked about NASS being the primary agency responsible for collecting and managing census and survey data, but NASS also works with other agencies. So NASS has collaborations with ERS to implement the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, among other surveys, and collaborations with NRCS to implement that SEEP survey that I talked about as well. The only thing I'll note about surveys, which is probably obvious to you all, is that they are expensive to conduct for many reasons. Working on the questionnaire, field testing the questionnaire, going through the survey approval process with the Office of Management and Budget at USDA, getting that survey out to producers. And then the other thing that's probably obvious, but like there's a lot of respondent burden associated with these surveys. And as a result, we've seen responses to USDA surveys go down, right? So respondent burden goes up, survey responses go down, farmers are busy. So we have to think about how to thoughtfully use that survey real estate to make it easy to answer for farmers, to not add additional burden. In some cases, that means we're trying to streamline. Sometimes we have to add additional questions to get at some of these practices that we care about, but always trying to balance that with this respect for farmer time and response burden as well. So filling data gaps, we're looking at that on surveys, but we're also looking at other data sources. We're also using some data products, and these are actually results of other data science initiatives to some extent that are happening at USDA that have produced products that we're finding useful for this work. And some of these I know are going to be a part of the data-thon this weekend, so you'll get to know these a little more closely. One example is the NASS Cropland Data Layer, which is an annual crop-specific land cover data layer produced using satellite imagery. So using satellite imagery to predict where different crops are grown. It has coverage of the continental US beginning in 2008, and it's publicly available there at the Cropland Cross website. The crop sequence boundaries are actually a derivative product of the cropland data layer because we had a research need at ERS to have a field boundary and a cropping history to be able to do analysis on like what cropping patterns were happening over time and then be able to sort of draw out that field. And so we started collaborating on this with NASS. We said, can we use the cropland data layer to figure out something that sort of broadly represents a field, right? And where we can also get these cropping histories. So as a result, NASS produced the crop sequence boundaries, or the CSBs as we call them, which is also a national scale product. It's these automatically delineated fields. They're not really fields, but they represent a homogeneously cropped area over a set time frame. And as part of that, you can also see what the CDL says the crops were on that area over a certain amount of time. Right. And we know that crop rotations are important for greenhouse gas emissions, other environmental outcomes. So you can also think about how you might combine those crop rotations in a certain region to be able to think about policy or environmental outcomes. So we're also finding this useful for our work, in particular, when we think about trying to estimate what proportion of cropland different crop rotations might make up. Administrative or program data. So I wanted to highlight one source that we've been looking at quite a lot, and this is both for the crop rotations work because the 578 data are used in the cropland data layer, and we're also using them for other things, but also for our work on cover crops. And this is a really good example of data that weren't really collected for statistical purposes, but that we're figuring out how to use for other purposes. Because every year, a producer who's participating in USDA programs has to fill out one of these 578 crop acreage reporting forms. And it basically just collects information on what crop is out there on the landscape, as well as a few other variables like planting dates, whether it's irrigated, et cetera. And the way we've been hoping to use this is actually to work on improving our estimates of cover crop adoption. But we know that the FSA 578 historically has not provided complete information about cover crop adoption because it wasn't mandatory to report cover crops. And then also because there was an incentive to report cover crops as part of the pandemic cover crop program that was implemented in 2021. And that program provided producers a $5 per acre crop insurance premium discount when they grew cover crops. That program was implemented for 2 years, but it's part of a broader set of programs. There were some state programs as well that have been experimenting with providing a crop insurance premium discount in exchange for growing cover crops. And that's, theoretically, that's due to this this hypothesis that growing a cover crop actually makes you more resilient, reduces risk, and therefore that you should have a lower likelihood of filing a crop insurance indemnity as a result of a natural disaster, for example, or a yield loss. So when we put these data sources together, and this is where it gets messy, right? And I'm going to use the cover crop example because I'm very familiar with the cover crop data, so it's easier for me to talk about it than some of these other categories. Here, I'm showing you actually just 2 sources of data, but in one case, how different agencies have presented the data differently. So you'll see some darker dots that represent our ERS estimates of cover crop adoption as a percent of harvested cropland that were provided in a report that I was a part of in 2021 that Stephen Wallander led. And then you'll also see the census estimates cover crops as a percent of total cropland, right? So 2 different estimates from the census. I don't necessarily need to get into why those denominators are different. But then you can also see up there, there's a SEEP2 estimate, which are cover crops as a percent of cultivated cropland. And I could have put some other data sources on here as well, right? Which just further complicate the picture of different data that we're getting from different sources about cover crop adoption. And this is often because surveys pull from different samples. They might be designed with different purposes. It makes total sense that they're estimates, right? So what we're trying to do is figure out what to do with this. Can we produce a consistent estimate every year of cover crop adoption, and what data sets do we use? So in order to do that, we are trying to come up with new approaches to combining data sources. The third type of data that I'm going to talk about because it's relevant to the cover crop example, which I think will help you understand some of the complexities of working with satellite and remote sensing data in this context, is this one. So remote sense data, cover crop example. This is just a shot from Sentinel, oh, actually it's Landsat from March of this year that shows you greenness in the area where I live, right? So wintertime greenness. I'm going to just ask you to think for a second about what things might be green in the wintertime, right? If you're driving around. So a number of things might be green, right? Weeds might be green. You might have winter annual weeds, either roadsides or showing up on fields, but at a certain point in time, depending on temperature and precipitation, you get weeds, and they often look green. You might also have forage crops. So in the area where I live, you have alfalfa, which is typically a perennial. That might be greening up around that time of the year. You also have a lot of dairy operations where I live, and dairy operations often grow forage crops, which in some cases are considered cover crops. But they're really about growing a cover crop or a grass crop that's then going to be harvested and fed to dairy cattle. So a lot of what you see in this picture is actually probably cover crops that are being grown for forage to be harvested and fed to dairy cattle. My point behind telling you this is that what you see from a satellite is greenness, right? And so it's a really good indicator of greenness. It's not a great indicator of whether a farmer seeded a cover crop. It's not always a great indicator of what happened to that cover crop, right? It's a little harder to see whether that cover crop got harvested later. In some cases, you might actually be picking up winter wheat or some other crop that's harvested for seed. All you're seeing is greenness at a particular point in time. So in order to discern uses or other aspects of cover crop management, you have to combine scenes from satellite imagery across a lot of different points in the year. And historically, I mean, the reason why this is interesting is because historically we've measured cover crop adoption by looking at what a farmer tells you on a survey. But if a farmer plants a cover crop, they may or may not get enough precipitation for that cover crop to grow, right? Or they may or may not seed that cover crop in a way that results in establishment and growth in the spring. They might even be seeding a cover crop that's designed to die in the wintertime, right? So say they plant that cover crop in August, it greens up in October, November, and then that cover crop is supposed to die at that first hard frost so that the farmer doesn't then have to kill it in the spring. Well, we wouldn't see that cover crop in March necessarily, right? So these are all of the complexities of trying to understand the intersection of what you observe from satellite imagery and the management practices that are going on in the landscape. And I think why it's hard to correctly use and interpret satellite data. Two things I'll note. There are a lot of different models being used that involve using roadside photography, AI, machine learning. Historically, these models were a little bit more structural and making assumptions about the relationships between some of the training data that were being used and the output. But really, there's a lot of methods going on. I'm sure you all probably know more about this than I do. But part of what we're doing right now is actually taking some of those products that are being developed either inside of USDA or elsewhere and evaluating how well those products are doing against some data sets that we have where we know that cover crops might have been grown or not grown. Interestingly, one of the problems that we're having is that it's much harder for us to know with certainty where a cover crop was not grown than it is to know a field where a cover crop was grown, for example, where NRCS paid for that cover crop. So I'm getting a little short on time, and I want to make sure that I leave some time for Ginger to talk about data access. And I don't want to skimp on methods. So one thing that I'll say, because we have a lot of data and a lot of people working on this, we decided we were going to use what we are calling a sub-team structure to develop these methodologies and figure out how they were going to address each of these problems. And we divided those sub-teams into different buckets by practices. So cover crops, crop rotations, you see all of those in the yellow. What we also did was develop some process sub-teams that we thought had some elements that were going to apply across all of those content sub-teams. So we developed a data linkage sub-team, a data management and organization sub-team, an evaluation of statistical properties across data sets. And all of these sub-teams are thinking about how to use those individual data sources to estimate something like tillage practices. And then they're making choices, right, about what types of models they might use, whether they're going to use a model or maybe they only have one data source and they can just report that straight estimate and use the survey weights, and it's pretty straightforward. In some cases, we are needing to figure out how to use weights that were associated with an individual survey, but combine those across different surveys to produce an estimate, which is not something that we often do at USDA. And then we're making decisions about what we might want to provide with our data series, right? Do we want to provide our source code? Is that something that we think we can realistically do and get cleared in our first year? Maybe not so much. So, I'd be interested to hear from you all about when you go and look at a data set or a data series, what are the things that you want to see in terms of code books, dictionaries, methods, et cetera? Those are the types of things we're talking about right now. Pretty much talked about all of these elements of the data series. Irrigation and tile drainage is maybe an example that I didn't talk about a lot, but there are a couple of other things that really influence greenhouse gas emissions. One of them is how wet the soil is because it influences the processes in the soil. And another one is, well, rice practices and irrigation and rice is kind of a subcategory of this that's important as well. Some closing thoughts that I hope you all will find and apply to your work. And these are just some things that I thought about as I was reflecting on the last year or so of work that we've been doing. I think it's really, really important when you do data science or any type of science that relies on data that you didn't collect, that you spend a lot of time familiarizing yourself with the data and the strengths and the limitations of the data. It may be tempting to just get in and start running models, but investigating missing values and zeros and talking potentially to the data owner about what the limitations are, doing some exploratory analysis that looks at patterns and looks for weird things, right? Like, are you seeing things that don't make sense or inconsistencies? Because those are going to drive your models and your results, whether you want them to or not, right? So understanding when those are showing up and how they might play out for your model or your process is really important. The second thing, again, this is probably something you all already know, but no matter what field or sector you're in, whether you're at Harvard or at USDA, data sharing, data cleaning, and integration of data are costly in terms of person power and time, in terms of money as well, right? By virtue of the fact that people's time costs money. It's just going to be an investment. No data set is perfect. And so always make sure that you budget that time, right? If you're going to do a good job for a project or, no matter what you're doing. This is related to the first two bullets, but the choice of tools and models really depends on the problem you're trying to solve, and the strengths and limitations of your data set, right? As I mentioned, in some cases, we're able to just think about it as a statistical problem. We have a survey that was designed in a particular way, and we can do an estimate. In other cases, we might be using a model that we think is going to work well to combine different types of data over a certain period of time. How you use training data, how you might be predicting certain estimates, all of that is context dependent and depends on how applicable, what you want your result to be used for, and the external validity of that result as well. I talked about geographers and statisticians and economists, and I think this is another takeaway, and this is something I've found true across all of my work over the last 10 or 15 years, and that's that interdisciplinary teams are really an asset when it comes to complex problems. So I've worked with agronomists over the years, like various types of people, and whether it's trying to dig in on estimating yields from farmer yield data, or whether it's trying to figure out how to put different types of data together, you need a geographer to really understand how to work with data that are geospatial and that describe environmental attributes or soil attributes on a field. So figuring out how to work in those teams can be complicated because we don't always speak the same languages. But in general, it's really been a strength for us as we go about this work to have an interdisciplinary team. I'm going to talk about the last one and then the next to the last one. Documenting or publishing your methods. And doing it as you go along. I know this is best practice now when people are learning data science to document as you go. When I was a PhD student, I was terrible at this, right? But it's going to save you time later, and because somebody's going to ask you about it and you're going to wish you had it written down. So whether that's documentation of a data set you're producing or publishing. And I would think about publishing broadly because sometimes there are opportunities to publish what you've learned from developing a workflow or solving a problem, right? Publishing isn't always about an academic exercise. I would encourage, especially the students in the audience, to think about how you might publish a case study of solving a problem, right? A data science problem, or developing a workflow, or even patenting a workflow or some code, or thinking really creatively about what publishing means and what output means in academia or really in any other sector. And then the last thing I'll say before I hand it over to Ginger is that there are often opportunities to provide feedback about data, right? So one of the things I'm looking for, especially internal to USDA, is how might we improve how some of the data that are being gathered are being gathered? Like, what can we add to the survey? Can we add new variables to a program when they're collecting information from a farmer that's participating? Can we get some more information as part of that? The answer might be no, but always looking for those opportunities, especially if there's already a process in place where someone's having to provide data. Often it's easier to tack one little thing on versus design a new survey or do something like that. So being creative about the data gathering process. That's my last closing thought. And I'll leave you with a couple of opportunities to access ERS data and ERS outputs. ERS is on X for sure, and also does a pretty good job of posting up reports on LinkedIn. But one thing that you might in particular be interested in is finding data at ERS. Our data products page is a good place to do that. And we also have a really popular product called our charts of note, which is available. There's an app for it, but you can also find them on the website. And it's usually just something from a recent report or output that has a chart with an explanation. So it's really easy to digest, just takes a few minutes. And it's a really great way to learn about agriculture if you're interested in agricultural production and some of the research that we're putting out. Oh, I did not mean to click on the link. Let's see if I can go back to that. Okay. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ginger to talk about how you can gain access to NASS data if that's something that you're interested in doing as part of your work.
Thank you. And if you could go to the next slide, Maria. So a little background about me. I'm Ginger Harris. I work for the National Agricultural Statistics Service, and I work primarily on the Census of Agriculture, but I also work with our data lab and our data access and disclosure review board. And what Maria's team is going to do is to create data sets that will be public. But as you remember what she said, some of the data in those data sets is SBCEA protected. That means record level data can't be made available to the public. But researchers have an opportunity to request access to some of that micro level data, which can be used for modeling and other projects. So you would do, as Maria said, NASS collects a lot of data both through surveys and through the Census of Agriculture. And I just wanted to give you a really brief introduction about how you would go about obtaining access to the data. First, you would apply through the standard application process. We would go through a security review and an access review to determine if the project you want to do is suitable for the use, if we think it is the data is fit for use for that particular purpose. And if your project is approved, you would go into a data enclave where you would do your analysis within the secure environment. And then once you had output that you would like to publish or take outside that secure data enclave, it would have to go through a disclosure review process. So if you go to the next page, again, Maria talked about SBCEA. SBCEA is what we live and die by in our work as a statistical agency. We collect the data with a pledge of confidentiality to the people who provide it. It may be only used for statistical processes. There are specific guidelines agencies must use to protect that data. And there are provisions within the law to make agents of others to use that data. When we work with SBCEA data, if we disclose that data, we're subject to penalties, jail time even, and as well as fines. So it's really, really important to us that we protect the confidentiality of the people who give us the data. If you go to the next slide, there is a way, and it's through the standard application process, that you would request access to the data. There are other agencies. It's a way for you to put in the standard set of questions you must respond to in order for us to review your application and determine if your project meets the requirements to use the data. There is now one place across all government agencies to apply for access to the SBCEA protected data, and that is through the standard application process. And we can provide details if anyone is interested in exactly like where you would go and what you would do. If you go to the next slide, You can see what data is available within this enclave. You can see like what particular data sets they have, what level they would apply to. Not all the data sets have the same number of observations, would be suitable for modeling at the same level. There's a lot to know about, but you can see again, you can go and choose, basically what data you want or see what data is available and then make an application for that data. I think if you can go down a couple slides, Maria, to the one that says the SZP application review. So this is really important. Before anyone is granted access to the data, we at NASS review that application and talk about it in great detail. It must be used for a statistical purpose only. It has to be feasible with the data. And as Maria said, we're data experts. We know how the data was collected, how the sample was drawn, so we can assess whether it's fit for use. It's required that when we have this data that we maintain our public trust, and also that any output from this use of micro level data is subject to just a statistical disclosure limitation. In other words, we must review any product you create from that micro level data, and any product, any data must go through the statistical disclosure limitation process. And this is all governed by our data access and disclosure review board. That's just a real quick glimpse into how you may go about applying for micro level data from NASS. That could be from the Census of Agriculture or for some other surveys, particularly the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, and that Maria talked about. That's farm level, lots and lots of detail. So that's something to think about if you are looking for data sources. You can think about using micro level data, and you would go through us to do that. And I think we're sort of running out of time. So I'm going to end my remarks now. And so we can hopefully get to some of the questions people have asked.
Yeah, hi. And Maria, you can come back too. Actually, one quick question about access to data. Are you able to explore data sets? Do you have sample data sets available before requesting to see whether or not it fits within research? How might one access that?
I do not believe we have sample data sets. You would basically talk to someone at NASS to say, this is sort of what I'm interested in doing. We have people you can talk to. We do not, though, have sample data sets. Most of our data sets are pretty small, and any of them would be subject to this confidentiality restriction. So it would be hard to create an anonymized data set that would be probably enough to see as a sample. But one of the things that are available are variables. For instance, you can look at questionnaires and see if the data was even collected that you might be interested in.
Okay, that's helpful. I think this person did ask about variables, so that's really helpful. So I'm going to bring it up a level. First I want to say, Maria, I love your closing thoughts because, as HDSI, we really think about how do we use Harvard as, the whole of Harvard to create, solutions to really complex problems, right? That through data science, right? And these are all multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary challenges. And so I think that, it really resonates, I think, with this group. Thinking about, someone asked about before data and how do you think about managing the before and the after? And knowing that you have historical data and knowing that it may not be representative at this point in terms of being predictive is a challenge. How do you think about that?
I think we think about this a lot, in part because we know that there are so many factors influencing farmer decision making, right? This is just one influx of money that's making more funding available for a set of practices, but there are many of these, right? We've got state level programs, we have different federal programs that were implemented at a lot of different times in the past. And honestly, in a lot of cases, it's really hard to get a causal estimate of an impact of a program. So I do have a lot of colleagues that work on this using whatever they're able to use, right? Like sometimes we're exploiting geographic variability and how a program was implemented, for example. So I have some colleagues that have looked at some watershed level initiatives and are looking at within and outside of a certain area, different payment rates, right? And what impact that had on decision making in different geographies. So I think in a lot of cases, we have like little experiments about how to look at causality and program implementation. It's a little harder to do that at the scale that we're talking about, like with the Inflation Reduction Act. We can look at trends and try and see if there are discontinuities or there are maybe ways of looking at that, but it's a little harder given the scale of some of those programs. So I don't have like an easy answer to that one.
Well, speaking of scale, I'm going to toss you another one about that, which is, how do you think about international collaborations? There was a question in the Q&A about providing access to data, and obviously SIPSIA is going to be, you're going to think about access through that. What does that mean for the prospect of sort of thinking about these challenges on an international scale? What do you think about that?
I guess one of the things that I know USDA is engaging, we're engaging with the UN and other institutions that are also very curious about how we're implementing policies and programs and the data that we're collecting, right? So as an international player, I think we're carefully weighing like how we can provide data to show that our experiment might be working or not working or whatever the case may be. Honestly, we're pretty far away from open data when it comes to US government data. And I think we'll be that way for a while, in part just because we don't have good, secure solutions, right? Like if we could have open data and still have anonymity and protect farmer privacy and not disclose individual results, maybe we could think about doing that, right? But we don't have the solutions for that as government yet. So I think really we're still thinking about some of the classical tools like aggregation and some of the things that we've relied on to prevent those things happening. In terms of sensitivity and international relations, I haven't thought too much about that. Yeah, obviously there would be concerns if we were talking about microdata, but I think in general at this point, we're mainly trying to be international players that are providing better and more timely information about how we're doing on greenhouse gas reporting.
I'm going to take a moment to plug that the Harvard Data Science Review, which is a journal that published by the Harvard Data Science Initiative, dedicated a special issue to differential privacy in the U.S. Census about last year, I believe it came out. So obviously these are challenges that are ongoing, and we're sort of still at the leading edge of trying to figure out how to do data well while respecting privacy. So final question that I like to ask my speakers, both of you, are there any recommended readings or journal articles that you like? Like what have you read recently that you said, oh God, everyone needs to read this?
Well, Maria thinks I will say NASS is pretty much in the nuts and bolts of producing data. So our research division publishes my work is pretty much in survey design, imputation, editing. So you get a data set, we create the data set for you. So I guess I will not comment on journal articles because that's not really what I do.
Well, I'll give a general answer to this, and I'll say that I really enjoy reading outside of my field, sometimes more than in my field. So I really like reading the remote sensing articles and like describing the machine learning methodologies and the data sources and how people pull things together. Because I'm not an expert in machine learning or data science in general, and I think that that's one of the fields right now that is making some huge advances in figuring out how to do that with diverse data sources. So I like reading the University of Illinois papers on that out of Kai Yuguan's lab and the Stanford papers. We also have a set of people that are thinking about how we might be able to do more machine learning with like livestock operations and identifying where things are happening and how that relates to greenhouse gas impacts. So that's an area that I've been enjoying reading in quite a lot lately.
At all. All right. So before we close, I'd like to mention that our next industry seminar is November 14th at 1:30 p.m. with Andrew Schroeder from Direct Relief. Registration is available on our website, which is datascience.harvard.edu, and through our weekly newsletter. So we hope to see everyone there. So with that, thanks again to Maria and Ginger. Thank you so much to our participants for your amazing questions. Stay in touch over the newsletter where we'll be announcing the winners of the Datathon soon. So we're really excited. So thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon and thanks for your time.
Great to be with you. Thanks.